It's one of those cop cliches, isn't it? We all have that one case that keeps us awake at night, wondering how differently things might have turned out if we'd made better decisions, read the clues better, not jumped to the wrong conclusion. True to form, I have one of those. I've served longer than most, just short of 40 years on the force, so I've more than my share of regrets. I suppose, in a way, saying I've one of these cases is a lie. I have dozens of them, cases I know I could have handled better, if only I made one or two different choices. There really is only one that keeps me up at night, though. The nights I fall into a trap, thinking about Cindy, or the ones I usually spend on the couch, sipping scotch, TV chattering away, but mostly watching cigarette smoke curling lazily towards the ceiling. At my age, I really can't afford to miss that much sleep, but what can I do? Once Cindy is in my head, I know Mr. Sandman will be giving my house a wide berth that night. Sleepless nights are probably preferable to the nightmares anyway. My story starts with a young cop, still a little green even after a few years on the job, giving some kid a formal warning for wasting police time. The more senior officers like to pass this kind of job on to me, stuff they thought was beneath them. But I was still young and keen enough that this kind of community policing still felt important. A teenage girl was in trouble for making a bogus call to the emergency line. She called in a panic a little before midnight, claiming that someone was stalking around her house while she was home alone, banging on the windows and giving her a scare. Would have been a standard prowler call. Turn on the flashing lights, do a walk around the property, be heard and seen doing our jobs, reassure the caller that whoever it was had been frightened off. But that's not how it turned out. Not really sure how it happened, but one of the attending officers got a bit suspicious. The girl said the prowler had some kind of makeup or mask on, so their face looked like hers. Creepy, right? Home alone, you're tapping on the window, and you turn around to see your own face looking at you. Ugh, goosebumps. So anyway, this officer does some digging and finds out this girl's been getting in trouble at school. She's been acting erratically, making up stories about someone stalking her. He talks to the principal, and it turns out that she's on the edge of being suspended, maybe even expelled. And their diagnosis was attention-seeking behavior. All these things are added together, and the call is officially labeled bogus. Well, the official terminology was knowingly making a false report. It's the kind of thing we'd generally ignore if it was just some kids messing around. But someone decided this girl needed to be taught a lesson. I think one of my superiors knew the principal or the school counselor or something. Like, maybe they did PTA together. It was decided that the police and the school would join forces and scare the kid straight. There was no serious talk of placing charges. No need to ruin a kid's life over a misguided attempt to get attention and sympathy. But I was given the job of sitting down with her in one of our interview rooms to make it look official and as scary as possible, and explain to her that wasting police time was a serious matter, and that there were healthier ways for her to get attention, and so on. Her dad brought her in. I should have seen right away that this was not a girl starved of attention. The guy obviously adored his daughter. You know how with some parents you can just see the love in their eyes when they look at their kids? I never had any of my own, but enough of my colleagues have been parents that I've seen that same look a few times since. Still, I knew from my research that Cindy's parents had split, so she was living alone with her dad, and her mother was renting a place on the other side of town. This was long enough ago that divorce still carried a heavy stigma in most parts of the country. and the rumor was that the wife had been cheating on him, and he'd caught her in the act and thrown her out. I knew of the father, though I had never met him until that day. He was a bit of a player on the local commercial real estate scene. Not rich exactly, but he did pretty well. Owned a couple of small strip malls, a car wash, a few other things. I think I might have seen his face in the paper a few times. Mostly on ads for his car wash, if I remember correctly. Cindy had made it into the papers more than once herself. About 5 years before all this happened, not long before I signed up for the force, she nearly died when a drunk driver ran a red light near her school. Sent her flying through the air and into a tree. Literally into a tree. Fire brigades had to be sent down to the ladder truck. It's a miracle she survived. Stuck a bunch of metal pins and stuff into her to keep her in one piece, including a full-blown artificial hip, which was state-of-the-art medical science at the time. Even with the best care, there was doubt she'd ever walk again. Then, just a few months before the call to the emergency line, she's in the papers again. Teenage girl, victim of a tragic hit-and-run many years before, expected to never walk again, wins silver at a state-level track and field event. It was a big story for a few days. She even did some TV appearances. Helped that she was a pretty young thing, with classic made-for-TV blonde hair and blue eyes, so her face had been everywhere in the local media for a week or two. I showed them into the interview room and sat them down. Explained that nobody was under arrest and no charges were being laid at the time, but that it was still a serious situation, so on and so on. Cindy spent the whole time staring at her shoes and looking miserable. She barely resembled the photos in the paper from just 1 or 2 months earlier. Her hair looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. There were dark circles around her eyes, like she either wasn't sleeping or she was crying all the time. Maybe both. Her poor dad didn't look much better. When I finished my stupid little speech, Cindy's dad gave her shoulder a gentle shake. She looked up at me. Those blue eyes looked distant and haunted. But she gave me what was obviously a carefully scripted and rehearsed apology. She swore she would never waste police time again. On the way out, Cindy's dad tossed her the keys, told her to go ahead to the car on her own while he had a quick word with me. She nodded miserably and walked away. With her gone, her father's brave facade crumbled, and I could see the exhaustion and fear hidden underneath. This was a man at the end of his tether, trying desperately to hold on to the broken pieces of his life. He started to apologize again for the waste of police resources, swearing that Cindy had never been in trouble before, and he couldn't understand her recent behavior. Suddenly, it was like dam had broken. Just like that it all came spilling out. Right there, on the steps of the police station, this poor guy wept as he told me about his daughter's increasingly bizarre behavior. She'd been missing classes and turning up late. She had begun making up unbelievable excuses when she was caught breaking the rules. Told me the school was talking about expelling her after she'd been seen by a teacher 5 blocks away from the school when she should have been in class. When the teacher approached her, she ran away and apparently doubled back and snuck back into the school. They found her a little while later in the school library. She swore she hadn't left the school grounds and ended up breaking down in tears, begging the principal to believe her. This is when I made the decision that would come to haunt me so many years later. This poor, desperate man who wanted nothing but to care for his troubled daughter asked me to come and have coffee with him after my shift. He said he had nobody else to talk to about it, and I seemed so understanding. I told him no. can't believe it, but I told him no. I patiently explained that even though she hadn't been formally charged, I had been the officer to deliver a formal warning, so it would be inappropriate for me to socialize outside work with her father. His face. God, I can still see it. It's like it was crumbling, falling in on itself, with that simple word, no. I had destroyed his hope, just like that. Next time I saw him, he was staring up at me from a slab with a split in his head that he could just about post a letter in. Cindy went crazy, you see. A couple days later, she took a cleaver from the kitchen, a big heavy thing you could split a turkey with, but instead of a turkey, she had split her poor father's head. He was asleep. Probably never knew that it happened. At least I hope he didn't. After that, Cindy took her father's car, drove across town to her mother's apartment, and let herself in with a key we assume her mother must have given to her sometime before. Her mother was asleep in bed with her new boyfriend. Cindy struck him once across the throat, almost decapitating him. Then she climbed on top of his body, took the cleaver in both hands, and struck her mother 47 times. She might have kept going, but the head of the cleaver broke away from the wooden handle and embedded in the bedroom ceiling. I was the one who found Cindy the next day. Grocer saw a blood-spattered girl stealing old fruit and vegetables from the garbage behind a store and gave us a call. I cornered her in an alleyway, a block away. Sweet Jesus, she was... Words can't really express it. Her clothes were caked in blood and brain matter, and she still had the broken-off handle of the cleaver in her hand as she stuffed a rotten dark brown banana into her slack mouth. I tried to talk her into the car, but there's no recognition in her eyes. She just sat there in the back seat, mumbling and babbling to herself. I got her all the way back to the station before I broke down. Someone else handled the paperwork for me while I sobbed in the chief's office, wondering if I had it in me to be a cop after all. It was a close thing, but the union put me in touch with the counselor who helped me a lot. I talked it out with her for hours about how I should have seen that Cindy was close to some sort of breaking point, and that if I had pushed a little harder, really listened to what her father was saying, I might have saved 4 lives. Cindy died, you see. She made an escape attempt from the holding facility where she was awaiting trial. It looked set to be an insanity plea, but few important people were pushing for murder with intent, even though she was only 16. She fell from a 3rd-story window that she'd somehow forced open and got impaled on the top of a tall security fence. The sharp points on top went right through her guts. I've seen the photos. One of the staff there told me it took over an hour for her to die on that fence, while the EMTs argued about how to get her down. I'm told she spent most of that hour giggling like it was the funniest thing she'd ever seen. Despite what she did, she and both her parents were buried together in the family plot. I guess the divorce was still recent enough that nobody thought to update the funeral arrangements. I watched the burial from my car. I didn't dare show my face. So, that's it. There's my story. My greatest shame. I was a stupid, young cop, obsessed with following the rules to the letter, and lost sight of what I got into the job for in the first place. Helping people. Decades later, I still wake from nightmares where that poor dead man shouts obscenities at me from his cold metal slab, the gash in his head flapping open and closed like a glove puppet. Sometimes Cindy is there too, giggling from the top of her fence, or mashing banana into her face with blood-soaked hands. Except that wasn't the end of it. For over 30 years, I thought that was the whole story. But fate still had one more kick in the ribs for me. I might have kept this whole story to myself, gone to my grave with it, if I hadn't had a visit yesterday from one of my old police colleagues. Dan started as a beat cop, but had worked hard at nights and weekends to get a couple degrees, and now he spent most of his police career in forensics. He's semi-retired now, mostly trains younger cops and techs, and does a little bit of light lab work. He turned up unannounced at my door about lunchtime, dressed in a midnight blue suit and holding a manila folder. After apologizing for turning up unannounced, he asked if I had time for a chat. I don't get a lot of visitors these days, so I was glad of the company. I told him to come in and get comfortable while I made a pot of tea. While I worked on the tea in my little kitchen, Dan sat at the table and told me there had been some human remains turned up at a building site. Some developer had bought a couple neighboring houses and was busily knocking them down to put up an ugly block of sheet concrete shoeboxes. But work had come to a screeching halt when the digger excavating found uncovered human remains. He was holding his folder in both hands, tapping it nervously on the polished pine tabletop. There was a long silence. I could tell he was trying to work up to something. Got out a couple cups and carefully lifted down the teapot while I let him take his time picking the right words. Still, I wasn't ready for what he eventually asked me. "You never got over that girl killing her parents, did you?" I dropped my metal canister of tea leaves on the bench top with a clatter. Luckily, I hadn't taken the lid off yet, or else there'd be tea leaves everywhere. Teapot forgotten, I sat down opposite Dan and asked him what he was talking about. He told me one of the houses being knocked down was the one where Cindy had lived, the one where her father had died. The remains they'd found were in the backyard of their house, buried in a shallow grave. I didn't know what to say, so he wordlessly opened the folder and slid a thin sheaf of photo printouts across the table. A skeleton laid in a dirt trench. I'd seen enough similar photos to recognize that the top third had been put back in place after the fact by forensics. I'd guess that's where the big digger had disturbed the remains. Poor builders must have almost died of fright when a human skull had peeked out at them from the dark soil. The lower 2/3 of the skeleton had been more carefully uncovered, and small numbered flags were stuck into the dirt around it. The skull was damaged, and I asked Dan if the digger had cracked it when the remains were discovered, but he said no. The damage seemed to have already been there. The skull had 2 neat splits on the crown, like the cause of death had been blows from a machete or an axe, or... That was when I realized what I was seeing, and more importantly, who I was seeing. The splits in the skull were just a clue, and I frantically leafed through the pictures until I found what I was looking for. One of the photos was a close-up of the skeleton's pelvic area, and I could see the top of the skeleton's left leg ended about a hand span from the hip. Above it, instead of bone, was a metal bar, topped with a lopsided ball, still gleaming, even after so many years in the ground. It was an artificial hip.